I am here with Kristi Carter Weil today, and she is going to talk about the amazing work that she's doing. And I'm just going to kick it over to her so that she can introduce herself and tell you a little bit about that work.
Jess, thanks so much for having me on today. I'm super excited to be here with you and your audience. So I'm Kristi. I work as a licensed clinical social worker. I'm in private practice in the DFW area. And I'm also a retired police officer from the DFW area. So I'm a mom of 2 and a wife. And a furry kid mom too. So we have 2 dogs and 3 cats and kids involved in all sorts of things. So it's kind of a wild life. I've also been married to my husband for almost 20 years, and we met on patrol. So I've been a law enforcement wife for a long time as well.
For a long time. And yes. So both you and your partner are police officers. You were, he still is.
Correct.
Like yes. Okay. So you know this space, and that led you to your current work, which I'm going to have you share with our listeners now. You got your plate full with life and fur babies yes. and kids and all those amazing things. But I think the work you're doing is, one, unique. There's not a lot of it being done. And I know that's part of our conversation. We need to do more of it. Absolutely. But I want you to share with the listeners what is the work you're doing, where you're doing it, because of course, share so people can find you if they need you. And also, why it's so important and needed and why it's not being done everywhere. That was a lot of questions.
That's okay.
Take it away, Kristi.
So early in my career as an officer, I was very interested in mental health. So I took a course to be a certified mental health peace officer in the state of Texas. And from there, it took on kind of a life of its own within my career. I ended up writing the curriculum and doing instruction for 12 years to officers of all ranks in our department on how to best deal with and communicate with people who are in mental health crisis. During that time, I became involved also in peer support, and I was our department's first co-response officer, riding out with a mental health professional to make contact with citizens who had police contact due to a mental health crisis. And also during this time, which we'll talk about, I had critical incidents myself, which is something that's very common for first responders, which led me to doing my own work around that trauma.
Yeah.
And I thought, this is something that first responders need. Mm-hmm. It's vital to doing the job, to, process the trauma from the job, but also trauma that we bring to the job.
Yeah.
And so I just thought, what better way than to go into private practice? I'm very lucky that I had some great mentors who have been through and kind of paved the way into this career. So now I am a trauma and substance use therapist, and I work at First Watch Consulting Group. I own that with my work partner, and we serve people of all different backgrounds, but we specialize in helping first responders. And I know that dealing especially with police right now and how things have gone with that in different areas of the country, that there has been a lot of grievous
Yeah.
Incidents with use of force. And I believe that helping officers and other first responders can allow them to provide their communities with the service that they want to provide.
Yeah.
That is caring and compassionate.
Yeah.
Because I don't believe that any first responder seeks to go in and harm somebody.
Yeah.
They really do want to help. And somewhere along the way, things kind of get twisted. And we end up with first responders that are not healthy themselves, which then, inhibits them from doing the work well.
Yeah. And I know you and I have talked about this a lot, and I know you understand the brain science behind it. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit of that, because it's really, I think it's really vital to understand how anyone with unresolved trauma or trauma that they have not accepted, recognized, worked through, how that actually affects our brain and how we show up in the world. Because this is, yes, it's very important for first responders, but this is for everyone carrying trauma, because it really does change your brain.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I think people aren't necessarily aware of, people know that if you witness something terrible or something terrible happens to you, that's a trauma. What I think people don't necessarily understand is that witnessing the suffering of others is also a trauma.
Yeah.
Secondary trauma exposure or vicarious trauma. It's called different things in the literature. That also builds up. And so the accumulation of trauma exposure, it causes us to lose so much of our creativity, of our ability to see the in-between, to respond quickly to complex situations. And that's what we ask first responders to do every day, is show up and react quickly and creatively to complex situations. And there's so much research now coming out about trauma. So there's the ACEs study, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And it is a list that, in a self-assessment where you can get a score, and that score correlates to different health outcomes.
Okay.
So we know that first responders, police in particular, report a higher ACEs score than the general population.
Yeah.
So there are people coming in to the job with more trauma than the general population. And frankly, some of that trauma is maybe a reason why they got into the profession. Right? To help people. But there's already, they're starting behind the line on trauma. We also talk about critical incidents, which is an incident that is out of the norm, that overwhelms somebody's ability to cope, involving a threat of life to themselves or someone else.
Yeah.
And when we look at the general population, that number is 2 to 3 critical incidents over a lifetime.
Okay. You're going to tell me how high it is for first
I am.
I can tell.
Yes.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
I'm going to brace myself for this. Okay.
Yeah. In over a 20-year career of being a police officer, we are looking at 3 per month.
Okay.
I'm sorry, no, 3 per 6 months. Sorry
Okay.
about that. 3 per 6 months.
Okay.
And up to 780 of them over the course of a 20-year career.
And the general population is 2 to 3 for our entire lives.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. That's huge.
It's stunning.
That's
really
huge. I mean, it makes sense, but I don't think I ever thought the gap would be that big, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so we think about that is confronting armed people, right?
Yeah.
For EMS, for fire, right? It's being in situations where they are in a warm zone. It's not totally cleared, right? Yep. There is that going on. It's responding to things like drownings, which I think we don't consider very often, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Traumatic deaths, suicides, domestic violence, those kind of situations.
Yeah.
So once you pile on all of these critical incidents, plus the higher ACEs score, plus the secondary trauma exposure,
yeah,
it is really no wonder that there is a mental health crisis for first responders. The very, I guess, the most generous I'm trying to think of the word. Some of the most generous stats that I have heard, conservatively, 35% of first responders have PTSD.
Wow. And that's conservative, which, yeah.
Those are the ones that seek help.
So let's talk about that real quick before we move into the good stuff of how we're going to fix this and change everything and what we're going to design. Can you share a little bit of the landscape around first responders and mental health? Are these systems and programs in place? I know you mentioned that you started and worked on curriculum down there, so I'm guessing if they are, they're relatively new, but like, what is that landscape? Is it something we talk about openly in those spaces? Is it still very shame-based? My gut tells me I know these answers, but for the conversation and for our listeners, so we really understand what's needed to do better, what is that landscape now?
I think it's changing. It's definitely changing. But it's the worst kept secrets that first responders eat our own. And I think that there is some fear around that, right? Well, they have to be faking. It wasn't that bad. That call didn't affect me that way. Because otherwise we have to recognize that we're all vulnerable.
Yeah. Whew. Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot of self-protection around the stigma of mental health care for first responders. Arlington PD started a program that has influenced other things across the state called the Blue Chip Program, where they have a list of culturally competent providers, and they pay for first responders, their spouses, and their children to go to therapy.
Wow.
Yes. So with that program, that influenced Texas Blue Chip, which I'm a provider for. And it is free therapy for any active police officer across the state of Texas.
Do officers know? I mean, is this widely known that it's available to them and they can reach out and get help?
I know it is very well publicized in Arlington.
Okay. Where it started. Yeah.
Yes. So Fort Worth PD has a similar program. And I'm really not sure. I know Texas Blue Chip had some media around that availability months ago. But I'm not really sure. It's hard to tell, what do officers in Gray County, Texas know, right? Up in the Panhandle, little bitty old department up there, right? Like, what do they know about this being available? Which is also crucial for them because it's rural and there are a lack of providers up there, right? And so it's really hard to tell, what officers know is available to them. Mm-hmm. And the really important thing to say about Arlington's Blue Chip program and Texas Blue Chip program is that they are totally anonymous.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Which takes a little of the stigma out for people who want. Okay.
Right. So it is only the provider that knows and the client who sees them. They're paid out through an anonymous system with codes. So that, I think, is one way that we can decrease the stigma and increase the access.
Yeah.
Because therapy is expensive.
It is. It is too expensive because I tell everyone, every single person walking this earth needs a good doctor, a good therapist, and a good coach. Yep. And then you have like the whole ecosystem so that we can thrive, right? We need all of those things. Okay, so let's talk about, because that was a good first step, right? It's a good that there's movement. We're trying to solve this problem. So I want you to share, what is your future vision for how this can look and work and how we can better support the mental health of our first responders and everyone else who honestly deals with traumatic experiences?
Yes. Everyone needs a therapist. Yes. Therapists need a therapist.
Yes.
Right. I mean, I see mine regularly. Mm-hmm. And I think it's just really critical for people to have an understanding of what symptoms they're feeling, which takes being vulnerable enough to look at yourself, right? Or having someone who can say, hey, I really think you're not okay.
Yeah. Out of compassion, right?
Yes. And I'm in your corner and I'm rooting for you.
Yeah.
Because as people say, it's okay to not be okay. Mm-hmm. And as a therapist, I don't want anyone staying in the not okay.
Yeah.
Because there are resources out there. So I think one step is to buddy up. Have people who can be real with you and you can be real with them.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about call-ins and saying, hey, I noticed this about you. Or this seems really off. And supervisors in first responder organizations are the first ones to see that.
Yeah.
And many departments have a system that will flag officers after use of force, absences, right? Mm-hmm. And then they're supposed to check in order for that to yield anything,
Yeah.
there has to be trust there. Do your people trust you that you will see them as an employee having a problem and not as a problem employee?
Ooh. Say that again. That is a huge distinction.
Yes. Will this supervisor see me as an employee having a problem instead of as a problem employee?
Yeah.
Many departments out there are doing training on trauma-informed care for the citizens, right?
Right.
But where is the trauma-informed care for the officers, the firefighters, the medics, right? The crime scene technicians, the dispatchers, the call takers. In all of these critical incidents.
So we need that in the future.
Yes. And
yes.
I think that dispatchers and call takers especially,
yeah,
they are on the phone or on the radio. So they are hearing people's worst day.
Mm.
They are waiting for officers to check in. Right? They're trying to keep track of everyone, keep everyone safe, dispatch the ambulance, the fire department, notify when scenes are clear for them to go in. I mean, there's a plethora of things that they do. And until I think it's been less than 10 years, dispatchers were categorized as clerical staff.
Wow.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, that's and to be completely honest, when I think of, and you and I have had these conversations before, but when I think of first responders, dispatchers aren't the people I'm thinking of. But now you're sitting here saying this, and I'm going, oh my gosh, like that's when people are calling in panic. And we are, I mean, dispatchers are carrying the weight of all of that their entire shift and beyond. And if they don't work through that, if we don't acknowledge it, if we don't give them the time and space and create those opportunities for them,
right,
then what's that doing to them and their mental health? Yeah.
Right. When there are critical incident stress management debriefings, the CISM debriefings, very often the dispatcher and the call taker aren't included in that because their own departments forget.
Yeah.
Which leaves them with less resources.
Yeah.
Without the benefit of the debriefing, because that's been shown to lower the incidence of PTSD.
Yeah.
And then it leaves this separation between the first responders on the streets and the first responders behind the console.
Right. Right.
Which is a huge place that we're also missing data on mental health.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And frankly, even for medics and firefighters, we are missing data.
Yeah.
Because they don't have a use of force problem.
Well, yes. Oh, and I also, I live in a place, and I think it's this way in most of the country, but your first responder here is almost always the fire department. That's just how it works here, right? So those are your first responders to most everything. Not always, and yeah, they're not going to be included in those stats because I think first responders and I think police. Okay, so while we're thinking about the future, before we get to roadmaps and all that, is what would an ideal, let's say there's a call, there's a trauma what does the ideal next step beyond that look like for the first responders, for the entire department, for like, what does a trauma-informed response look like? Or what could it look like, I guess?
Right. I think first it's recognizing the sheer number of critical incidents and offering support for those. Because right now, across the country, critical incidents that get the full peer support response are generally line of duty deaths and officer involved shootings.
Okay. That's it.
Yes.
Okay. Which I think those definitely should.
Absolutely. I do think we're getting better, but the first step I would say is we need to recognize what a critical incident actually is beyond those very strict parameters. Because if we are experiencing up to 780 critical incidents throughout our career, and I can count the number of debriefings that I've been personally involved in on one hand, that's an inadequate response.
Yes.
Right? So I think there's that.
Yeah.
I think it is also important, vital, actually, to include all first responders in the research.
Yeah.
Just because we want to figure out, right, how to solve this use of force problem with police does not mean others are not suffering or that others are not serving their community in the way that they could.
Right.
Right. So where we have blue chip, where is red chip for the firefighters, right? Yeah. Or white chip for the medics, or gold chip for dispatch and call take.
Yeah.
And so I think we include them in the research. We include them in the solution.
Yes.
Right? To this overall trauma-informed response, that we offer services that, you know, our first line supervisors, instead of saying, well, I don't want to bring this up with the officer because it could cost them their career, that we know that it will cost them their career.
Yeah.
If we don't.
Yeah.
And that getting help, going to therapy, going to rehab does not mean the end of a career.
No. So I just want to say what is rattling around in the back of my head, because it might make it too simple, except I don't think it does, because it's the work I do too. But it's like, if we want our first responders and our police officers and our firefighters, we want everyone to show up as their best selves for the job so that they can best serve the communities and the people that they want to help and serve. So we want that. And we know that in order for people to flourish, they need to take care of their physical health, their mental health, their emotional well-being. All of those things need to be addressed. And what I'm hearing, and it's not surprising, but what I'm hearing is we're not getting those needs met. And yet we, the public, and probably the supervisors and everyone, is expecting that these police officers, that these first responders are showing up as their best selves to every single call, but we're not providing the resources or support for them to be able to do that. That might be too simplistic, but to me, I'm going.
I think that's it. Okay. I think we provide the resources.
Yeah.
And it's not just officers out on the streets, right? It's also detectives.
Yes.
Crimes against children detectives, right?
Yes.
Sexual crime investigators, domestic violence and interpersonal violence investigators.
Yes.
Robbery investigators, right? I mean, there's just a whole swath of people who really get that secondary trauma exposure on some of the most horrific cases that we come across.
Yeah. And what you said at the beginning of this conversation, we were talking about how does like not dealing with this actually affect us? And you said it affects our ability to problem solve creatively, which is inherently what makes us human, our ability to problem solve creatively. And the roles you just listed there, like, I don't think people look at first responders and detectives and police and say, this is a creative occupation. But for them, like for people to be able to show up their best and do their job, they need to be able to problem solve and show up in that way. And so, you know, I'm piecing it all together in my head. I'm sure other listeners are too, but it's, again, we can't expect them to be able to be problem solvers and to show up as the full humans they are if we are not taking care of their needs, their human needs, their very human needs. Yes.
Yes. And it is, you know, talking about that creativity. You know, one of the big pushes has been to send mental health professionals out to deal with societal problems.
Yeah.
Right. To deal with people in mental health crisis, to deal with unhoused people.
Yeah.
So if you think you get a call about a disturbance by an unhoused person at a gas station, what will be my options there? Because that's where the creativity comes in.
Yes. Yes.
Versus disturbance, you're going to jail.
Right.
That's very easy.
Right.
To say, oh, you're intoxicated in public. They told you to leave and you didn't. So here's a criminal trespass charge. Right.
Right. Which doesn't address needs and spirals the system. And
correct.
But if our brain doesn't have the ability to creatively problem solve there, that's why we keep getting in these circles.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Because in my opinion, politicians see police as cheaper to fund than social services. Right.
Right.
And we are just kind of lost in this loop of we don't have good resources. Police really aren't the answer to that.
Right.
But I've seen first responders who are amazingly creative, compassionate, and that paves the way for the next first responder who comes behind them to have a relationship. Any contact with a first responder paves the way for the next one.
Yeah.
Right. And you know, when you show up and the last experience was not good.
Right.
Because that paved the way for the next one. Right.
You're bringing that with you. Yeah.
Correct. Yes. But also it works the other way.
Yeah.
If we can build trust and think creatively. Right. I mean, we think of showing up to a call with, you know, everything hitting the fan as the complex situation. And it is. But so are these societal problems.
Yeah.
They're also very complex.
Right.
And so, and it is demoralizing to first responders to continuously be sent to these calls with nothing they can really do.
Right. Right.
And so I think that's kind of the other leg of that is to take that responsibility of being a social worker off of first responders.
Yeah.
And allow them to do what they were hired to do.
Right. Well, it's that quote, you know, we're pulling people out downstream and we're never going upstream to stop people from falling in. Right.
Exactly.
And you need both of those because there will always be people that fall in, but we can certainly lessen and help on both ends.
Absolutely.
Okay. So how do we get from here to there? How do we get, you know, mental health support where it's needed? How do we build departments where first responders feel empowered to take care of themselves and their people. I mean, that's the other piece of it, right? They're people.
Right. I think a lot of that is in our communities, our local communities, to vote for the leaders that we want in those communities, people who value mental health for first responders, right? There's a lot of back the blue.
Right.
Well,
how are we backing them?
Correct.
Right.
Yeah. So I think there's that. I think it is talking to the mayor, the city council members, right? Your state reps, and saying, what are we doing for our first responders to allow them to serve us well? Yeah. Because that's the goal. It's first responders' goal, and it's the community goal.
Yeah.
Is to be well served. And I believe from the bottom of my heart, that's what every first responder sets out to do, is to serve their community. And, you know, I'm not talking about trauma as a way to say that it excuses horrendous act, right? Because it doesn't.
Right.
There are tons of officers who have unprocessed trauma, and firemen, medics, dispatchers, right, that have unprocessed trauma that serve their communities with integrity.
Right. But what we also talked about is they could still be serving their communities even better if they had the support to work through those, right? So they're doing good now. What could they do if they were actually supported and had access to the tools they need?
Right. Yes.
Okay, so what can we do? What can we do? What can I do?
I want you to call your mayor, your city council, your city manager, your police chief, and say, tell me what programs you have in place to address first responder mental health. Tell me what peer response programs you have in place and how you utilize those to respond to the critical incidents, the 3 that your people are experiencing every 6 months.
Yeah. And when they tell us, yes, we're doing all of these things, or no, we're not doing much.
Right. I think for the departments that say, yes, we're doing all of these things, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
And I know that much of, you know, the funding for the blue chip programs is through grants and private donors.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yes.
I wouldn't have expected the private donors, but that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
So where's the line item funding for that in the budget?
Yeah.
Right.
And if there's not that support, if they don't have those things set up, if they haven't thought about it or don't know where to start or don't have the funding, how can we help, or what's the next step? Then you go to the mayor and you go to City Hall and you get funding.
I think that it is also, if there's nothing available, then it is saying, okay, who can we meet with? Is there a resource that's out there already? Is there a larger department that has a peer support team, right, who can come and help a smaller department?
Yeah.
That does not have the funding.
How do we get creative?
Right. If you do not have the funding to pay for first responder therapy, do you have the funding to pay for a mental health check-in yearly?
Yeah.
For your first responders?
Yeah.
Right? Is there a way that's totally anonymous, frankly, that is for the benefit of, right, the officer, the firefighter, the medic, the dispatcher, the call taker, that allows them to build a relationship with someone.
Yeah.
And to be able to monitor their own mental health. Because if we are not healthy on the job, we're not healthy at home.
Yeah. Which is a whole different story.
It is a whole different story.
For another
all
day.
tied together. Yes.
It is. Yes.
Yes.
Because that's the unresolved trauma. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it is getting creative about, if you don't have enough money for this, can you do this?
Yes. What can we do?
Yeah. Right. Because surely it's something.
Yeah.
Or if you don't have the money for that, can you become a trauma-informed workplace?
Yeah.
Where we see employees as someone having a problem versus being a problem. Right. And so there are so many ways that we can change the culture, provide services, include the broad spectrum of first responders in our services, and that we can also talk to our representatives, our senators, right? And say, statewide and nationally, where's the funding for this?
Yeah.
How is this not a statewide program?
Right.
How are we relying on grants and private donors, which, I mean, I'm so thankful for them.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. Yes.
For the private donors, for the people who write the grants and research those. It's a ton of work.
Yeah.
Right. For the people who administrate these programs.
Yeah.
So thankful for them. And in our country, we should not be reliant on grants that could be discontinued. Right. On private donors to fund this.
Right.
And so I think it is from, your little community. And so in Texas, we have to be different.
Yes, so, it's very Texas. Yes.
It is very Texas. We have to be different. So we have our National Night Out in October.
Because so coming up.
It just
happened. Okay.
Yes. Have you ever been to a neighborhood National Night Out?
No.
It is where neighborhoods, communities, churches come together and invite first responders to their National Night Out parties. So it's a great way to meet your police chief, meet the officers who patrol your area, meet the guys from the firehouse that's closest to your neighborhood, right?
We love our firefighters. We were down there last week.
Yes. Yes. Everybody loves the firefighters.
We love our police officers too, but we were just down at the fire department.
Yes. Yes. Well, we have, cops and firemen have a special relationship, right?
I'm sure.
With teasing each other. So, but it's a great way to get to know your neighbors and to get to know the first responders that serve your area.
Yeah.
So maybe that is also a goal, is does your neighborhood, does your faith institution, right, have a National Night Out party?
Yeah. And go to it.
Yes, and go.
So I heard a couple really good next steps for all of our listeners. The first is to reach out to your local departments, reach out to your local government and see what's happening, what's being done in this space, how we're supporting our first responders. the second one, I'm glad you touched on it there at the end. And I think it's really important. And it's what we say a lot on this podcast and in my work. But it is seeing one another as humans first. And I think a lot of times, because of the cultural, the way we speak about police officers and firefighters from when we're really, really young, right? They're these cultural like superheroes that are supposed to have all the answers and do the right thing all the time. And I think just taking a step back and going, these are humans who need the same support and stuff that I need. And reminding us to see the humanity in the police officer that shows up, in the fire department, in the police chief. I think you've touched on that a lot. And I think that's super important.
And, I think that that's something that gets lost kind of behind the uniform.
Oh, yeah.
When you were supposed to show up and be professional and unflappable and take care of the situation, you're in control of your emotions, right?
Right.
And you're supposed to abide by your training and go in and get things handled. Yes. And so as we shove everything down, call to call, right? If we never let it come up for air and process that, we lose some of our own humanity. And then it's that much harder to see the humanity in others, right? Because people really do want a robot who comes in and does the right thing every time.
Yeah.
And someone who offers that personal touch and compassion.
Right.
And so it's a place where so many first responders feel torn.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Of not being able to win.
Right.
And I think the winning for everyone is having healthy first responders as public servants.
Yes. And that is a great place to end this conversation. I could go on and on. I think this is, first of all, thank you. You are doing such important work. This conversation, I'm sure it will be an eye opener for a lot of people. I know every time you and I talk, I'm like, wow, I've never thought of that. And I think no matter where you are, where anyone is on the political spectrum, like this matters and this is important because we do want our first responders to show up for us as their best selves so that we are taken care of. And that means that we need to show up for them too and support them. And we need to make sure they are taken care of. And I think this conversation, honestly, is a lot more fruitful than most of the conversations we're having about police and first responders and even mental health in general. So thank you. You're doing amazing work. And I hope our listeners all of you go out, call your people, find out what's being done locally, because that's honestly where we can make the biggest impact. And those local things, the same way Kristi talked about it, they set it up in Arlington and it rippled from there. And that's how this works. But it's our responsibility to say this is important. It's important.
Yes, it is taking that torch and running with it within your community. And I really appreciate you having me on the show. It is so important that people understand what first responders need.
Yeah.
And that we want to show up.
Yeah.
As our best selves.
Yeah.
And we need some help doing that because of the job we do.
Because you're humans.
Yes. Yes.
You're humans that face really hard things. Way more than I ever pieced together and way more than the rest of us. And I think each of us can go and look at what the trauma has been in our life, because we've all had trauma. As Kristi said, we have 2 to 3 traumatic incidents throughout our lifespan. But if you just sit there and go, that was my trauma, and that happens 3 times every 6 months.
Every 6 months. And that's on the low end.
Yeah. Like,
right, of what the research says.
Yeah. And like, I can feel that in my shoulders right now. Like the weight of that is, I think it's important for us to understand that, because then one, we can become part of the solution, but two, it gives us a better context, or maybe a more realistic context around some of these horrific events that have taken place. And no excuses for anything on either side. Like, but when we are in a society and a culture that doesn't deal with trauma, no matter where you are and what you do, that doesn't prioritize mental health, we can't expect everyone to show up as their best self in every situation. And that goes when you walk into a white collar office, to when you walk into a warehouse where you work, to being a first responder. I mean, that applies to all of us. But first responders
Absolutely.
have to show up in some of the worst and hardest situations. And we ask them to do that in non-human ways, without support. And I do thank you so much for doing your work, for sharing your story. I'm going to, I'll link to the work you're doing. I'll link to First Watch Consulting, and reach out to Kristi if you know anyone in this space. If you want to help in this space, Kristi's amazing. We go way back. Is there anything else you want to say before we end this conversation? Again, I could keep going, but
I know, me too. So I just would love for first responders to hear me say today, after a 20-year career and as a police wife, that there is something so inherently hard about the most routine things that we go to. The most routine calls still leave that residue. And that there is help for you if you feel like you cannot show up as your best self regularly. There is confidential help for you. There is culturally competent help for you. And you deserve, as a human, to feel your feelings and to not be overtaken by them. And any first responder who would like to reach out to me, I will get them connected with their local providers who can competently serve them in understanding what they do.
Wow, what an invitation. And it is important. And everyone deserves help. And so do take Kristi up off on that, seriously. And know that there are people who support you and want to see you flourish, and believe in the best of your humanity. I don't think that gets told a lot, but yeah, you're doing amazing work. Kristi, you're doing amazing work. It's so important. And I hope this conversation keeps going. I hope it sparks a bunch of other conversations, because it needs to. We need a change here. You said there's some momentum growing. This is,
Yes.
We're on the right path here. We just need probably to get it done quicker, and get more access to more people.
And how impactful to have this conversation in connection with the work you do around happiness. Right? We just don't connect that very often.
But it comes down to exactly what we've said. We all want to show up as our best selves. We feel our best when we're able to show up as our best selves. We're able to share our gifts so much more when we're able to show up as the best people we can be. And so, it is so intimately tied. And we want that I want that for everyone. And so really that's what these conversations, it's like, how do we get that to everyone in all these different spaces? because I do think, and I say happiness can change the world, that happiness is all encompassing. It is being able to show up authentically and confidently and compassionately and with purpose and all of these things that we've talked about today. But we need systems that are designed for those outcomes, and systems that support us in our full humanity. And that's what you're trying to build here for first responders, which is why I want everyone to hear this story, because I also think, there are people all across the country who want this done. And so when we have, you said it about first responders, how you show up with a first responder tells the next first responder. But that's what these conversations do too, because these conversations give other people who want to make a difference in these spaces the confidence and kind of a mentor in how you can start showing up and doing those things. And that's why we have the call to actions. That's why we say, here's how you can take ownership and make a difference. And so we're all going to call our local people. That's what we're going to do when we get off, when you're done listening to the podcast. And you're going to really start again training yourself to see our first responders, our helpers, our civil servants as the humans they are behind the uniforms.
Absolutely. As we can all see each other as humans in crisis.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Kristi.
Thank you.
I am blessed to know you as a person, and I am so proud of the work you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me on. I love you dearly, and I'm so excited to partner with you in working on this.
Yes, absolutely. We're going to change the world is what we're going to do with everyone too.
All right. One system at a time.
That's right.